Hi everyone, welcome to this week's video. This week I'm going to be talking to you about making a bulb lasagna, which is a really fantastic way of having some really cheerful colour in your garden next spring. And not only for just a week or so at a time while one flower comes into bloom, the idea with a lasagna is that you're going to have layers of different flowers that are going to come into bloom at different times in the spring, so that your display stretches out over a large number of weeks, maybe throughout the whole of April and May if you're lucky. So the great thing about lasagnas is that they can come in so many different combinations. It's a case of choosing your favourite spring bulbs and then planting them up in the right way in layers in the pot. So we're going to have a look at that today and some of the combinations of flowers that I like to use. To do a bulb lasagna, you're going to need a few different things. So the first thing you're going to need is you're going to need a decent sized pot. It needs to be a decent size and a decent depth so that you can get the different layers of bulbs in it. So this one here is about 30 centimetres deep, about 12 inches, and that'll give me enough room in there for a few good layers. And it needs to be a pot with some drainage holes, because the worst thing for bulbs is sitting in really wet, soggy water. They'll rot, they don't like too wet. So we must make sure we've got drainage holes, and then we must make sure that we've got some old crocks to cover over the drainage holes in the bottom, and that just stops them getting clogged up with soil and then they can't drain properly. So good sized pot with drainage holes, some crocks to cover the holes, and then you're going to need some good compost as well. Multi-purpose is absolutely fine, but what I add to it is I add some potting grit just to provide a little bit more drainage, and that just means that they're not sitting in wet soggy compost throughout the winter. So I'll show you that just now. So what I've got in my bucket here is just a mix of multi-purpose compost. This is one that I've been using, Westland Multi-Purpose Compost with John Ennis. And I've used about 4 parts of the multi-purpose compost to 1 part grit. And this is just a combination that I like to use. And I've mixed it all in. And the potting grit I use is just, again, Westland potting grit, things that I can get at my local stores. And this just means that when you plant your bulbs in it, they're not sitting on really soggy compost. They've got nice drainage from the pebbles there, and it'll sit nicely in there all winter without any chance of rotting. You'll also need your watering can to give the bulbs a water once you have finished planting them. And of course you're going to need your bulbs. So let's have a look and see what I've got here for putting in my lasagnas today. So on the potting table here, I've got a lot of different types of bulbs, and the main thing that you're looking for in a bulb lasagna is you're wanting to plant the latest flowering and the largest bulbs at the bottom of your pot, and then you work up. So the mid-flowering would go in the middle layers, and then the earliest flowering, smallest bulbs would go on the top. So I've got some things here like Purple Sensation Allium. That's going to be one of the things that I put on the bottom. And then over here I've got some Apricot Beauty tulips, and I've written on there that they are mid-flowering in April in the spring, so they can probably go in a middle layer. And then next to that I've got over here some Tulip White Prince, and I've wrote on that as well that it's an early flowering tulip, and so that might go further up in my layers. What else have we got here? We've got some Narcissi Silver Chimes. Again, that's a mid-flowering in April Narcissi, so that can go in the middle. Over here I've got my Pheasant Eye Narcissi, and this is a late flowering Narcissi, so this would again go on the bottom of my planter. Mascari, and I've got some Iris. These are nice to go on the top layer. You could add some crocuses if you liked, or some snowdrops, they're also good on the top. So the first combination for my bulb lasagna that I am going to be doing today is going to have a bottom layer of Pheasant's Eye Narcissi on it. And I've chosen those ones to go on the bottom because they are my largest bulbs, and they are also the latest flowering Narcissi that I have. They will come up in May and create a nice display then. In the middle layers, I'm going to put some Apricot Hyacinths, and I'm going to put some Apricot Beauty tulips in there as well. And these are mid-flowering in spring, and they will come out in April time. And on my top layer for the bulb lasagna, I'm going to put in some early flowering tulips, and these are Diana. They're a really nice white one, and they will come up for me in probably early April. So you're doing that pattern of the smallest bulbs, earliest flowering on the top, going through to the mid layer of mid-flowering bulbs, down to the bottom where your largest bulbs that are flowering latest in the spring are going to be. And at the end of the video, I'll do a recap as well on what you need for making a bulb lasagna and some examples of flowers you can put in the different layers. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to just lay our crocks over the drainage holes so that they don't get clogged up with soil. So this first layer just needs to be a couple of inches so that those bottom narcissi or tulips or alliums, whatever you're putting in as your largest, latest flowering bulbs, they have a good depth of compost to grow the root system down into. So spread it out there, and then we will be ready for our first layer of bulbs. When you're putting in your bulbs in your bulb lasagna, you have to put the pointy end up and the root section down, and you want to space them about an inch and a half apart so that they're not touching. And depending on the size of the pot will depend on how many bulbs you will get in each layer. So there we go, that's a nice layer of bulbs in there. So I think I've got 7 bulbs in that layer. And then what you need to do is you need to add your next layer of compost. So you're covering up those bulbs completely with a good layer. An inch or so on top, and then you'll be ready to put your next ones on. The large ones on the bottom, they will grow up and they will bend their stems round the ones that are growing above them. So it's quite clever. You would think, how can those tulips and those narcissi right on the very bottom, how are they going to grow and be able to flower if there's lots of bulbs layered on top? But it does work, and they just bend round and then they grow straight up out the top like you would want them to. So for this layer, I'm going to put in some Apricot Beauty tulips. The important thing to do when you are putting your tulips in is just to check that they are all firm and there's no rotten bits on the tulips. If they look at all rotten or mouldy, then don't plant them. And again, space them out so that they're about an inch and a half apart, so they've got plenty room to put down roots and grow nicely. Last one in there. So in this next layer in my bulb lasagna, I've managed to fit in 13 tulips, and now I'm going to do the same again. I'm going to cover them up with my compost potting grit mix. I'm now ready to put in my next layer of bulbs, which this time is going to be some Apricot Passion hyacinths. I really like hyacinths, they smell absolutely gorgeous in the springtime. So we'll space out our hyacinths in this layer. So this third layer that I've built up in my bulb lasagna has 10 of my Apricot Passion hyacinths in it. And they're a bit bigger bulbs and they will flower in April. They flower a little bit earlier for me if I brought them into the greenhouse, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to keep these pots outside over the winter and they'll flower outside. So for my last layer just now, I am going to be planting some early flowering tulips, which are Diana. And they should flower for me in March or early April. Again, I'm spacing them out, making sure that there's no bad ones there. that they're all healthy bulbs that I'm popping in. So that's my last layer of tulip bulbs in there. That's Tulip Diana that I've put in there, and they are going to flower in late March or early April for me, and I've managed to fit 12 in that top layer. So that is the final layer covered up with my compost and potting grit. The final thing to do now is just to give it a water. And then I'm going to be able to put that bulb lasagna pot outside in the garden for the winter time. And if there are any creatures that like to come along and nibble your bulbs over the winter, you can put over just a layer of chicken wire over the top, and that should help protect them in the initial stages of growing. And then next spring you can look forward to a lovely flowery display in your container. So just the same as before, this is a square planter this time. I put crocks on the bottom, I put that first initial couple of inch layer of my potting grit and compost, and now I am going to be putting on my Purple Sensation alliums on the base. So we're just going to pop them in, make sure that you've got the root bits down again and the top facing up the way. Some bulbs it's more easy to see than others, but on this one that is what the base looks like and should be pointing down the way. And that is what the top looks like on the allium. I love Purple Sensation alliums. They are fantastic flowers in late May, June time. And you can also put irises in your bulb lasagnas. You can put anemones in there. You can put ranunculus, freesias, crocuses on the top layers. So many different flowers that you can put in. So just choose your favourites, but remember that read the packets and see what they say, and put the latest flowering ones right down on the bottom of your pot, and often the largest ones down as well. And you might want to mix it up like I'm doing with different types of bulbs. So I'm using like alliums and hyacinths and tulips and narcissi. But you could just use different combinations of tulips that just flower at different times, or different types of narcissi that flower at different times. So you could have a very nice bulb lasagna of the same type of flower. So I've got 10 of my Purple Sensation alliums fitting on the bottom there. Cover them up with some of the compost mix. The next layer for me after the alliums is going to be these lovely maroon coloured Havran tulips. So we'll pop them in there. So this is going to be a darker display in this bulb lasagna than the one before, which was more my apricots and my whites. And hopefully the blue mascara will look nice on the top, and the iris spot on are a really beautiful small iris as well. They've got lovely markings on them. Tulips bulbs come in different sizes, so you might find that in one layer you'll fit more tulips on than other layers because they're smaller bulbs. So we've got quite a few tulips in this particular one. It's getting cold enough to be planting tulips now. The main thing they don't like is to sit in the wet. So just whatever you do, make sure that you do have drainage holes in your pots so that the bulbs don't rot. So I've got quite a few in there with these tulips. That looks like we've got 15 there in that layer. So my next layer is going to be my Narcissi Cheerfulness, which are one of my top favourite narcissi. They're absolutely gorgeous. And we're going to put some in here. Can't wait to show you these in the springtime on a video and see how they turned out. You'll have to let me know in the comments section as well what combinations of bulbs you've been putting together if you've been doing a bulb lasagna. It's always great to get other people's ideas about what looks really nice together. So after the cheerfulness, I'm now going to put in some of my fringed white tulips, Honeymoon. And that's going to be the final layer of larger bulbs, with just my mascara and iris going on the top. These bulb lasagnas that I'm making up today contain flowers that I'm hoping to use for weddings as well. And the great thing about having a bulb lasagna for me is not only will it look nice, but I'll be cutting from it as well. So I can move the pots around, and if I need to take them into the greenhouse because of bad weather around the time of a wedding, then I can do, so that the petals don't get damaged. So this is just to show you a bulb here. I'm just not quite so sure about this one. Seems to have a little bit of mold around the edges there. It's a bit softer and more squishy than the other one, so I wouldn't plant this bulb. It's not a healthy one, and then it could spread disease to the other bulbs. So we'll set that one aside. So it's just a case of checking them when you plant it up. So there we go, that's a nice layer of those lovely tulips, and we'll cover them over as well. So that's the honeymoon tulips covered up, and now we're just going to get some of our smaller bulbs here. We've got our iris, and we're going to pop them in for a nice early display on the top. So this top layer, it's a great layer for putting on all sorts of flowers like crocuses and snowdrops and iris. Early flowering bulbs that you will see first in March and April time. And you could even add some winter flowering pansies to the top if you wanted to, while you were waiting for the bulbs to come through. So I've just put a layer of gritty compost on top of my mascara and my irises, and I will just give it a water just now and let it settle, and then this container is going to go outside, and then come the springtime we'll get a beautiful display, and it'll be these mascara and iris that flower first, maybe even in March, which will be some nice cheerful colour when it's still quite wintry outside. So a quick recap about making bulb lasagnas. You want to be making your bulb lasagnas with spring flowering bulbs in the autumn time. So anywhere between September and early December really, so that they'll flower well for you in the spring. What you're going to need a large pot with drainage holes. You're going to need some crocks and grit to put on the bottom to help with the drainage and stop the holes getting clogged up in your pot with soil. You're going to need some good multi-purpose compost, watering cans that you can water the bulbs in when you've finished. You're going to need some gardening gloves because some bulbs can be irritants on your hands and your skin. You're going to need a variety of spring flowering bulbs that flower at different times so that you can get a nice display the whole way through the spring. So in terms of building up your bulb lasagna layers, the bottom layer on the bottom of your pot is always going to be the largest, latest spring flowering bulbs that you're wanting to put in. So examples that I might put in would be alliums, which will flower in late May, early June, late flowering narcissi like my pheasant's eye, which will flower in May, and late flowering tulips that I might have. So some of these are more of my burgundy ones, my black hero and my black parrot ones, and havran. They are all going to be flowering later on in the season. In terms of the middle of your pot, the middle layers, you're wanting your mid-spring flowering bulbs, so the ones that are going to be flowering for you in late April or early May. So things like that might be hyacinths, it might be mid-spring flowering tulips like the apricot beauty we put in, it might be mid-spring flowering narcissi like the silver chimes I used or the cheerfulness, and you can also put other flowers like ranunculus and anemones in this middle layer. The top layer is going to be the smallest and earliest spring flowering bulbs that you have. So these are going to be things like your snowdrops and your crocuses and your miniature iris and your mascara. These will all go on the top. Or if you've got any early flowering tulips, they can also go on the top. So like my Diana ones, which were going to flower in late March, early April for me. So that's me made up all 3 bulb lasagnas this afternoon. There's 2 that I showed you earlier, and then I made up a 3rd one with just a combination of tulips and narcissi. So I'm really excited to see how those turn out in the springtime and show you them then. Please do leave a message in the comment section if this is something that you've tried at home with any success before. Tell me about your favourite combinations of flowers. It's great to share what works between us. Next week I'm going to be back in the garden and I am going to be planting up the tulips in their beds. Hopefully the rain will have stopped then and we'll get a good chance to get on and get these finished before it's time to start making Christmas wreaths for my local customers.